Arctic Boreal Vulnerability Experiment, the working group collaborations and engagement working group. It's nice to speak to you today. And I'm happy to be chatting with you with two really great colleagues of mine, Jeremy Brammer and Erika Tizya-Tramm, both of whom I've met in Old Crow for a common project back a while ago now, which we're going to talk lots about. But now what we want to discuss today is what's written in front of you, addressing local priorities while enhancing research outcomes with community research or partnerships in Old Crow, Yukon. And curiously, you can probably see these two images on the right. Back in 1979, we have Danny Cassie holding onto a mammoth tusk. And then below, we've got Danny again on a boat with me, heading out to do some water sampling. And he's been a regular participant in my field work, and just a fantastic individual who's been very helpful for getting going, very interested in the data. And so it's been a pleasure to work with him. And I've had the honor and the privilege now for up to 18 years to be working in the traditional territory, the Buntuck-Gwitchin First Nation. And my research, I'll just introduce myself. My research is primarily focused on hydrology and biogeochemical spatial patterns, as well as landscape changes and inventorying things like where the shrub has grown up, where thaw slumps have happened, how they change over time, and how all that affects downstream environments. And of course, definitely the impacts of fire. And this involves working very closely with the community in Old Crow and the Buntuck-Gwitchin First Nation, as they have so much information about the landscape. And they also have their own priorities and concerns. And so my research there was born out of this International Polar Year project, which was titled Yindu Non Nakwinjit Katra Hanatra, which I tend to butcher the pronunciation in Gwitchin, my apologies. But in summary, the program was aimed to provide or document the natural history of Old Crow Flats and understand environmental change and how that relates to traditional use within Old Crow Flats. And during that time, that's when I got to meet Erika Tizya-Tramm. We can see in the photo on the right, that's me trying to figure out a Campbell Scientific MET station back in 2007. And Erika was working with me, and she did some water sampling, and she worked with several others within that group. And then also Jeremy Brammer, who is pictured down in the right, a nice old IPY photo. And he was focused on wildlife dynamics back at that point. But currently, Erika is she works at Yukon University, and she's the community partnership manager. And Jeremy is a fish and wildlife manager in Buntuck-Gwitchin First Nation. So, Erika, could you provide just some further introduction into what your position is and what you're up to?
Sure, yes. Thank you for inviting me to this opportunity. This is really a lot of what my current role focuses on, is working with large research collaborations and informing on, forming meaningful and beneficial partnerships with Indigenous communities. A lot of our work at Yukon University is focused in the northern context, but we do have a lot of interest from southern research institutions on how to engage and bring more meaning and relevancy to the research that they do, which often takes place in the lands of Original peoples. And so in the spirit of reconciliation, we're really just trying to focus our work in informing that and building that. It's funny to be here with Kevin. I started out very much green when the IPY research came to Old Crow. And like Kevin said, I was very much engaging with the researchers and processing samples and going out in the field. And now I find myself on the other side informing researchers on how to do that in a good way. So it's been a long journey, and it's good to be here and speaking to a time that really was I would say groundbreaking at the time, because it was a large international collaborative effort that was focusing really on listening to what the priorities or key concerns were of the region and the people that live there. And I would argue that it led to richer outcomes that benefited both research and the community, um, which is important for communities in their own pathway. So I'll just leave it there without getting into the presentation, but that's my role in the IPY and my current role with Yukon University. I'll pass it on to Jeremy. Thanks.
Yeah, thank you, Erika. I have a similar but different background. I started as a master's student under the International Polar Year Project in Old Crow, and so that's the bottom right-hand corner is the beginning of my graduate studies. And through my graduate studies, and then graduating and getting employed first with Environment and Climate Change Canada, and then afterwards as the Fish and Wildlife Manager with the Vuntut First Nation. So kind of coming around full circle to the beginning of my graduate studies, returning again to work with the First Nation that helped me kind of really begin my professional career. So it's been a formative experience from the very beginning. It was the relationships that were the foundation of my master's research that then became a doctorate. And as those relationships grew and developed, it then changed the direction of my career to become much wildlife research that was much more oriented towards questions of priorities to northern communities. And that path eventually led me to working directly for northern community with the Vuntut. So that's the role that International Polar Year played in directing my career trajectory and ending up with me in this role today. Kevin, back to you.
Okay, so for this presentation, I'll be introducing each slide, and we only have 3 more slides, and just bring up the topics, and then this will be more of a discussion among the 3 of us. And so in this first slide, it really goes back to focusing on this project because, as Erika said, this was a really great example of something that was where there was this sense of a true collaboration happening. It was really driven from the community with their concerns of changing conditions and the element of food security in the future, and with hopes to build resilience. So, and that's what this first point talks about. And the others can chime in more with that and what the aims were of that project. Now, the next point is what is required to pull something off like this, which I do believe it's happening more, but it's just definitely worth reiterating. And I'll just get to it is, before I took any samples back in 2007, I was involved in a preliminary meeting with the community, and that initial discussion was happening. And so that's not always, in conventional funding structures, that's not always able to happen, but we're seeing more movement that way anyways. And then we also have some lessons learned. It's never perfect. I continue to try to figure out ways to maximize my data sets. Like really, I've got so much data, and I've presented a lot of it, especially on the landscape change. And that should be reiterated for the ABoVE community, that a lot of these visuals and maps of the different characteristics of the landscape can go a long way, and so I've leaned on that quite a bit in the last few years when I'm communicating some of the landscape changes that I'm investigating, but also I have a biogeochemical record going back many years, and trying to really maximize the utility of that. It continues to it requires more attention and improvement. So we do have lessons learned from the IPY project and beyond. So Erika or Jeremy, if either of you have thoughts on those points.
Yeah, I guess I'll jump in. Just based on my experience as a community member that was involved in this project, I think it's safe to say that I observe research really moving towards this space where I guess academia is kind of breaking down its own structures that have limited them in a lot of ways, are now opening up to be more inclusive and respectful of where Indigenous knowledge and place is in research, to one that's less extractive and more collaborative. And my own experience, early days when I was in university, was very very disenchanting. But now that I'm in the role I am now, I really do see funding structures changing, to relationships changing, and how researchers are thinking about these questions early on in their research, and how that can inform their design, and those outcomes are being thought out. And there's a real effort I see being made, at least in the North, where there's strong Indigenous governance systems and agreements with First people. And so IPY, I really think at that time was showing how that led to more, I guess, rich results for everybody. And I think if in funding your work, if that can be thought of in ways of how you can support communities through your research, that happens very early on and on the front end of that work. So I just wanted to add that piece. Jeremy, I don't know if you have thoughts to.
Always have thoughts, Erika. So I think that that Kevin and Erika have introduced the International Polar Year Project and its long-term consequences, some of which you see here just with us being here together and having maintained the professional and personal relationships over the years. But of course, the consequences go far beyond us being here today, and there are relationships that have been formed that have withstood the test of time. 20 years about down the line since kind of the early planning for International Polar Year, and quite a number of publications and research that has been done as a result of that work. And I think it's important to, in my mind, to complete the circle again, come back to the very beginning, which is the photo in the top right-hand corner, which was relatively unusual at the time and still is quite unusual, was all of the principal investigators involved in a considerable funding application, before they've even submitted the application, find the funding to go to the community where they want to be conducting their research, and then to write their funding application together with representatives of the community. And so that photo, I believe, is at the end of the trip or of a similar trip. I might be getting my dates a bit wrong, but just that idea of, working in the First Nation government now, it's still not commonplace for large research collaborations to plan ahead of time to come and work with a community government or organization to develop the funding application. And that approach really then enabled the project and the research to have greater consequence at a local and regional scale. To the bullet points here is to contribute resources, capacity to the community, to the region, to be less extractive and to have stronger relationships that have stood the test of time. It was really the first step, really laid the foundation for those consequences. And the second point here of that's often a challenge, and our funders I see are starting to become more open to the idea of including in a funding application either, you know, like a pilot step as part of a letter of intent to provide funding to then speak and take the time to develop an application with communities, or perhaps, you know, it's more at the tail end of one funding cycle prior to the next one to report on the work that we've done this far and plan for the next. But I'm seeing a greater openness to this concept that has, you know, been around for 20 years and longer, but is not always acted upon in the cycle, the rough and tumble of the cycle of people seeking funding and then executing projects. It can be hard to take that time, to not rush it, and to take the time to start things well with a strong relationship with community. And then the final point, the lessons learned, even with that step, even with that planning early on, it can be difficult to project one's planning and thoughts into 10, 20, 30 years down the line and think about legacy pieces. And one of the challenges we faced with the International Polar Year Project is a lot of the research. We had a number of different principal investigators in different fields, and they were all looking to establish monitoring protocols that could be maintained over time after the end of this funding cycle. And that requires capacity. That requires those monitoring protocols to address a local priority. Some organization needs to take on those monitoring protocols. And so I think that's been one of the challenges, is translating, you know, Kevin's case, he's talking about multi-decades of data, but not all the monitoring protocols have been maintained as a result of International Polar Year, because of those challenges of who takes responsibility and how do you move them forward. So having that thinking on the long term as well is something that we learned from that experience.
I'll just chime in and say that paper that's cited there, that is a description basically of how that early project evolved and was maintained throughout, with regular community meetings, workshops in schools, and that kind of thing. So you can check out that paper. It's also important to note, it just occurred to me, well, it didn't just occur to me, I know this, like, I've been working in one place and conducting a lot of research in one place over a long time. You know, it's inevitable that you're going to develop these you know, relationships that really help push one's program forward. And I understand, you know, and one thing I should note that is that Old Crow in particular that's something that struck me right away was that high interest in what was going on, and the questions that were put out were, you know, there was this positive request to bring the science community in and to have that collaboration happening from their end. So that, I don't want to say that I was spoiled with Old Crow, but like the people there were really, you know, there was high interest. And the other point I was making is that I've been in one spot, and I realized that that's not the case in programs that have a tighter timeline and have to cover a broader area. You know, if we talk about the spatial context, the airborne campaign, for example, it would be impossible to maintain something like this. You have your key sites like in Yellowknife and elsewhere where you'll land and engage, and but maybe if there are other folks that are willing to or want to start up a new project, maybe consider some of these more in-depth protocols or ways to move forward and think about those legacy pieces and everything that Erika and Jeremy just mentioned. I'll just end with this has also led to, there's been many offshoots of this. It wasn't just about IPY during that period. I've been involved in a bunch of different research projects. So has Jeremy. Erika's done a bunch of different things over the last while, and new projects emerged. This was a newer project. This was one I was involved in with my close colleague Pascal Wale-Baye and others, where we were working with the Vuntech, which to know about the environmental changes in Old Crow Flats so that they'll know what will happen in the future. This was a title that and a logo, in fact, that was jointly developed with the community. For example, the logo was designed by Mary Jane, on the outside was Mary Jane Moses with all those traditional plants within the VGFN traditional territory. And then the inside of it was designed by Nicole Corbière, who is a student at Laurentian U. So it's really symbolic of that collaboration, and that process makes those projects so much more rewarding as well. And that focused on permafrost. There was some biogeochemistry looking at mercury spatial patterns, as well as shrub encroachment and impacts of that on lake hydrology. Okay, so slide 3. And this slide is all about maybe just take-home messages to consider when developing a project or wanting to engage a little bit more in depth or be more closely engaged with a community. And so the principle of putting the community priorities and their importance up front, that can guide research directions and certainly maximize the outcomes. It's important to involve the community from the beginning, and this is sort of reiterating the other point that we made, and consider potential benefits surrounding community and the research program. So what instead of just getting those academic outcomes, how can this build capacity or build up something positive for the community at the end of the day or within that process? And I'll just post this as well. There's also many considerations which we'll likely touch on, and I'll pass it over to one of my colleagues here if they want to discuss any. Maybe Erika.
We'll just keep our order.
Sure, yeah.
So again, from a community perspective, I can't emphasize how important this is from a community perspective. Like, I'll just take an example. Building this capacity piece, say at a youth level, can really lead to a lot of important changes within the community when their youth are being brought into things like research, where they can experience not only what research looks like and how that's done, field work, that sort of thing, but also getting them out and active and involved in things can lead to a lot of significant positive outcomes for the community. And I guess I could use myself as an example. The International Polar Year Project really helped inform my own direction and pathway, and has ultimately led me to where I'm at today. And so I think we alluded it to before, we can't always see what's going to happen 20 years from now, but what I can say is that collaborative piece and that early engagement and building those relationships often will always have positive, long-lasting effects. So even though you can't really tell the future, you can be sure that setting your project up in this way does lead to all sorts of successful outcomes, whatever they may be. The other thing I would say is that I know the world of academia has its own agenda. It's publish or perish. There are careers that are being built. But if you could find a way within that system to align yourself with as much of the values and priorities of the community, then I think you're starting to see that cross-pollination between the places and people your work happens in, and how that informs your own work within your own pathway. And it doesn't have to be mutually exclusive. I think, as we're working towards whatever reconciliation is going to look at, it's that you're doing this keeping in mind that the community has its own priorities. It's dealing with a lot of external issues that without being properly, I guess, benefiting from things like research that often I think a lot of research relationships have caused harm because there's been a lack of consultation or engagement with the community, whether it's intended or unintended. And so these kinds of things start resolving themselves when research is engaging meaningfully with the communities to make sure that you're getting the perspectives you need to make sure your research design and outcomes are beneficial both ways. And I'll just leave it there for Jeremy to add his thoughts.
Mm-hmm. That's easy to follow from Erika. That covers it really well. I think that there are these fundamental principles that I think can apply regardless of the field of research. And we'd have to adopt an approach that is specific to a field and specific to the community in which, or communities plural, that a researcher is working with. And so if we have it at front of mind, this principle of keeping the importance and the beneficial aspects of research for the community at the forefront, this principle of having community priorities at the forefront, and of ideally, at a minimum, kind of baseline, not doing any harm. And it might come as a surprise to some, but research can be harmful, even a research that is done with the best of intentions and no intent of harm. It can just be, say, taking people's time and resources away from larger priorities at the community level to accommodate and aid and assist researchers pursuing their projects that will not advance a community interest. So having these principles in mind can help guide researchers working in any field, but how that will manifest itself is going to vary a lot based on the field. So an example of my work as a field wildlife biologist, we're going out in the field with community members working on research questions that are identified by community members. But for a desktop analyst, that might look very differently. That might be attending an annual community gathering where research results are discussed with community members with a feast at the end of the day, or preparing a one-page report that with infographics that really highlight the community oriented or the community relevant results of that desktop analysis. It can manifest itself in a number of ways, and the only way to really know how one's research can align to some community benefit, when it can be minor, it can be a major project like developing curriculum for the school, but the only way to know how to align is through that engagement and that relationship, that working with community organizations, often a local government or a co-management board. And I think that one thing to have in mind from the beginning is we have these principles in mind, and with those principles in mind, trying to establish where one works, what already exists in terms of a research prioritization process at the local level, because some regions have really built a framework to aid researchers in identifying what are community priorities and how can they contribute to try to facilitate that. So it's not every research project or every group of researchers is starting from scratch. That can be challenging. That can take a lot of time, both at the community and at the researcher end. And so some regions, for example, in Old Crow in the North Yukon, we have every 5 year a community workshop where community members can bring forward their research priorities for the next 5 years. And then we produce and share a report with researchers identifying these are the priorities, these are the things that community members have brought forward that they'd like to see that researchers try to advance. And then as an individual researcher, one can see, well, is there an alignment between my work and the community priorities? Can I contribute anything? Or is maybe the alignment in a simple, like a one pager or what have you? So I think that we keep returning to the fundamental principles of keeping community priorities up front and building that relationship, because ultimately there isn't a one size fits all cookbook for how to conduct research in a community engaged manner, because that's going to vary based on the field and the communities in which with which you're working, and the scale, the number of communities is going to dictate as well the degree of that engagement. But having those principles in mind can really help guide work and project planning in particular, for different research groups. And I see it kind of in academia. Most academic appointments, or many, have service and education as components of those appointments, right? It's not just seen as principal investigators being purely researchers. There are some positions like that, but many positions involve a service and an education component. And the service component, often in a university context anyways, is really focused around service at the university, kind of committees, appointments. But I see this as just an extension of that principle of service outside of the community and towards the larger, in this case, Northern Canada community, but to a larger global community, of trying to have a presence as a researcher, as a principal investigator that serves, that offers service, that offers education, and that offers research. And so that's kind of the foundation here of what we're describing.
I'd just like to point out too that Jeremy and others in Old Crow have put together an annual research roundup, as it's referred to. It's been a very helpful, useful forum for bringing together a multitude of different projects and research that's gone on in the area. So there are these places, that exist that have these types of structures, and it's important to tap into those before assuming you can just show up and start doing research on the ground there as well. Old Crow has strong interest in research, but they also need a heads up for people coming to a place like that. So doing some homework before you just head somewhere too is really important point to make that just came to mind. But really, that last point there for the considerations, it's all about building on the respect, trust, and mindfulness. And yeah, both of you made really great points there. And Erika, just that first point, recognizing that research happens in a system with people, I think you articulated, the reasons for that really, really well. And we just have one more slide, and there. We just want to discuss some of the benefits and outcomes, and just the rewards that go beyond the conventional academic rewards from this type of research. And so we can talk a little bit about what benefits the community, also benefits the research and the researcher. There's examples of other projects going on that we can discuss if we have time, and the relationships, these last 2 points go hand in hand, but relationships can lead to positive experience beyond the research. And these relationships can then fuel trajectories of researcher careers and motivation. And I realize that with many of you, we might be speaking to the choir, but we've got some of our own examples that really come to mind. And I'll just begin with myself. The top right corner, that's a photo of when I was off doing a snow survey with Joel Peter for 5 nights out in Old Crow Flats near a place called Selma Lake. I was looking at snow density measurements and did a bunch of them around Selma Lake, a drained lake, just to look at how the snow water equivalent is different among land cover types, and related that actually back to the Avers data that was in a recent pub in 2021. Anyways, that publication is a nice outcome, and it's great, and I enjoyed the science behind it. But what isn't discussed there is this master class in winter camping from Joel Peter, a respected elder from Old Crow. I learned so much, and so that's one of these incredibly powerful experiences that can shape an individual. That's not necessarily getting me a promotion or anything, but that relationship was such a key part of my experience. And there's so many of them, like that. We have lots of different, we have Caleb Charlie down there in the photo, the second from the left there, working with a fixed wing drone. He's often Brooklyn right now. I'm not sure what he's doing, but after this, he gets into photography and flying his own drones, and we're certainly proud of him. And anyways, I've got lots of experiences, but I'm going to let others talk about these points as well.
I can't really speak from a researcher's experience perspective, but from a community perspective, I took away a lot of funny stories of researchers. They often need a lot of help in the field from the local community, and there's a lot of fun adventures. But I think the biggest one is, and by the way, if you're not being teased, that's a big sign that there's a problem. Have to tease the researchers. I think the biggest one, though, is just what you see on your screen here. Like me, Jeremy, and Kevin have intersected along this 20-year course, all based in around research. And we keep coming back to one another because we can, I think, because it's just so demonstrative of how what can come out of taking on these collaborative relationships towards knowledge mobilization, which from an Indigenous perspective has always been a key part of our survival and sustenance. But now to be able to ally with Western academia from a knowledge mobilization lens, we begin to open up our spaces a bit better to see how different ways of knowing and those relationships with the land can really provide key insight into Western academic knowledge acquisition and mobilization, and that should go both ways, and that's a positive thing for research, and it's important for communities because, and as Kevin said, Old Crow is a very research positive place because we ourselves have always been our own kind of researchers, and we welcome additional knowledge to help us move forward in our self-determination and our needs to address our priorities. So in a big way, that's a big benefit from working together that can push both of our shared goals forward together. And Jeremy moved back to the community and brings with him so much knowledge and experience to help support our community in pushing forward, and really brings the methodology that's needed to, from things like being at the negotiating table for harvesting caribou, that really gives us a strong starting place to talk to governments and other stakeholders in our rights recognition. Kevin, he continues to do research in our area of land, and it's been so meaningful because Kevin can see the changes from his lens based on the research he's done for many, many years. And we've called on him on times to help us understand what might be contributing to factors of changes we're seeing on the land. I could go on and on. There's benefits in all sorts of ways that really, really, again, coming back to the principle of having engagement with the communities and establishing those collaborative co-developing pieces that are beneficial to everyone. I'll hand it over to Jeremy.
Thank you, Erika. That's actually a difficult one to follow, I would say, Erika. I should have gone before you this time because I think Erika spoke at these high level, really capturing overall the richness of community engaged research and what it can provide, universally through the lives, not only the professional careers, but the lives of the individuals, and take directions that might not have been foreseen or almost never are foreseen really at the beginning of a project like Caleb being a frequent contributor to BBC film documentaries and things like that. When we were taking him out on aerial surveys, the first times I mean, we were never discussing videography at all, and there's a benefit that we all get to be very, very proud of, to see his career flourishing. I think I would maybe end on a nuts and bolts side of things. So this is why maybe I'm coming down into the weeds a little bit more, but thinking about from a researcher perspective, there are so many, very practical benefits as well of working with communities, or, very operational day-to-day benefits. So one is kind of in understanding and interpreting one's results. So we've heard already for fieldwork how it certainly facilitates fieldwork of having the assistance of community members to think, oh yeah, I'm just going to walk across here to access that field site. No, you can't walk across that area. Say it's not traversable. We've got to take this different route. That's a very, very practical benefit, but also in contextualizing one's results and interpreting results. And I can recall during my graduate study days, in fact, we were getting some outputs from remote sensors regarding freezing lakes, freezing to the bottom, and being given maps of, we think this is the bathymetry of these lakes based on our data examining as it freezes to the bottom through the winter. And I'd share that around with community members and spot essentially like no, that's totally incorrect. We need to send that back and get it reanalyzed. And there was a feedback loop there where the remote sensors were really benefiting from just taking their data, their analysis, and doing their first ground truthing, just speaking with individuals in community and getting a better idea of, does this make sense to you, or does this seem way off? And it was fueling their analysis at that time, an immediate benefit. And similarly, when it comes to, now in my work, often in project planning, we see that a lot of funders are looking to support community engaged research, and that's now a priority right from the get-go from funding agencies, is seeing research that has that community engagement and benefit. And I certainly see that in my day-to-day work in the times where we collaborate with researchers, we can access funding opportunities that are not available for research that is not as community engaged. And so the benefits go from the temporal scale that Kevin and Erika were really mentioning, decades into enriching one's lives and one's careers and feeding into one's publication record, but also in the immediate, in this month, next month, and over the next few months, the benefits are there for community engaged research.
I think I'll just end with the point. Thanks to both of you, first of all, for being a part of this discussion. This has been really satisfying, rewarding for me to reconnect with you two, and Erika, all the way back to 2007, building that Met station. This has been really neat to get together like this. I just want to end and say that if I were to, it's been just throughout this discussion, I've been, I have this, how to communicate this, and maybe there's a conceptual diagram out there, but if I were to think about it, just with considering just this slide in particular, it would likely be a circle. And what's going on in my mind is the work is being done, and the desire to see the results is really pushing it forward. But then the experience that you get in doing the work and the relationships that you build are actually pushing it forward to wanting to provide information for the community that's practical and useful at that level, in addition to those global concerns and global forums. So it's this cycle that really is a positive feedback that pushes into it. And so every time I go to Old Crow and I do research, or I'm meeting with the community, I get this really push and desire, motivation, as that last point says, motivation to do more research and motivation to provide more insight if I possibly can. And right now it's like, how can we make that useful to them? And so I'm just going to end it there, and others can chime in. Libby, would you like me to stop sharing them?
Sure, I think that's fine. I thank you so much for the presentation. I really enjoyed hearing you talk about your experiences, and I'm going to take the sort of convener prerogative here to ask a question. You were talking about sort of how the IPY is really what was able to bring you all together, and I know that they're in the process for planning the next IPY, which isn't going to start. I think it's like 2032 or 2033 is when they're planning on launching that. But I've also heard that there are some efforts underway to really make that an Indigenous-led IPY. And I wondered if you all had thoughts about, you know, the structure of IPY and how that happens, or advice about, you know, not that I have any influence in this at all, but I'd just be curious to hear your perspectives about such a really huge thing like IPY and what that means and how it's implemented.
I guess I could jump in. Just reflecting back, like the project that we were involved in was, so this is the Government of Canada IPY funding. And it was the one project that got 100% funding. And the reason was the strong community component. So I can see how it's even pushed more towards that way. And it does make sense. I mean, these are the communities that live in the areas that were most interested. So I have, this is the first I've thought about the next IPY, to be honest, but maybe others have thoughts on that. It certainly would make sense to me to figure out how to, overall that project was positive and it had great outcomes and evolved, and there was offshoots and other things spawning after it. So yeah, if done right, I think that would be a great way to go.
Erika, do you want to go or should I jump in? Change the order.
Let's change it up.
Okay, we'll change it up a little bit. And yeah, I think on maybe I'll stay lower nuts and bolts and you can do a higher level. But what I think is I have been thinking only a little bit about International Polar Year in the next iteration, but because of the benefits that we've seen from the previous iteration, there's so much potential for the next round that it's something that's worth considerable reflection, and I think also discussion would be kind of what I would like to highlight, that in the different regions of polar Canada at the very least, and most likely the international polar regions, I think local governments will want to have a say, but the way the system that would require will vary by region. And so to have the time to be able to open those conversations with, say, the national governments first and establish how do we want to provide project assessments and project approvals within Canada for our polar regions, and then internationally as well. Is there, a one table for all of Canada, or do we split Canada into regions? And then similarly, would we have international tables? And to provide a venue for community feedback that can address the perennial challenge. If you're working in a one community region, then you can engage with that individual community. But if your project is spread across the traditional territories of 30 communities with regional governments in some areas and then individual governments in others, you're faced with the challenge of who do you speak with? And I think that establishing that question would take time to do it well. And so thinking about 2030, 2032, it seems wise to me to have that, to be able to put community priorities forward would take the time to start that conversation and to establish those systems.
Yeah, I guess I'll just add to that I'm a part of a lot of Indigenous advisory groups where projects are looking for that guidance to help shape and form whatever program. So similar to what Jeremy said, is that I think that's really key. Like, there's a lot of power imbalances between Indigenous people and institutions like academia or government. So how do we address those power imbalances? How do we put the money right in the hands of Indigenous people to make those decisions and to resource these projects? Also, looking at all levels in research, where do Indigenous people show up? And if you're not seeing them, then that is asking some questions about what's going on there within that system. So hearing, that IPY 2032 is looking to be Indigenous-led, I think the world is screaming for Indigenous-led research. We're the eyes on the ground, and we can inform a lot of where we need to direct the resources and efforts to look at what is happening. A lot of Indigenous lands are the most biodiverse, and we're seeing a lot of alarming changes on the ground that we don't understand. Like, there's external forces at work. So there's a lot that can come out of an IPY that's Indigenous led. But the how question, that's the fun part. And that's where we need to start working together. Going back to the principles of the presentation, really just getting out of our structures that keep us, the blinders on our career paths and whatever, would be far more rich if we start talking with one another and putting people in places where the decisions and the resources are truly going to the people that can direct that research. That's my big dream.
So the crucial thing being that there needs to be enough time and planning. It's not one of these things where, IPY's in 6 months, go figure it out and come ask for money. It needs to happen years in advance. So I think,
yeah, 100%. I point out, Kevin, thinking about the Old Crow example of IPY, the fact that the PIs took it upon themselves, they found the funding to get to the community with which they work. And so that was kind of going off on a limb. So in this next generation, maybe we could have it that it's not going off on a limb for a group of PIs working with communities to have the support to get to those communities and to spend some time planning with them, for example.
Right. It looks like Libby's having some technical difficulties. Does anybody that's joining us have any thoughts or questions? Hands. Oh, John Morris. Go ahead. You could unmute. I think you're muted, John.
There, is that better? Now you can hear me?
Yeah.
Good. I'm John Morris. I'm calling from Eagle River, Alaska. I'm a science communicator. And I'm just curious, it's clear from your presentation that the direct relationships and engagement with the community is one of the best and long-term, most effective ways to communicate. I'm just curious, in addition to that, whether from your Old Crow experiences, you've had any other more tangible communication products, videos, clips, exhibits, displays, publications, any that you found particularly useful that were effective over time?
I'll just say, for myself, when we go back regularly, it's really the face-to-face is important. I've left posters behind that go up in the John Tizya Visitor Center that show some of the data and examples of where the land has changed. We'll put pamphlets together. It's kind of all those things that you would probably already think of, really. And this is one of my ongoing challenges, is trying to figure out how to maximize that data, as if I iterated before. I'll let Erika or Jeremy speak to this as well. I think also just talking with people out in the field, but go ahead.
Maybe I'll jump in again, and then you, Erika. Thank you, John. I think you probably are aware of most of the communication tools that we have been using. So I'll try to think of the more, maybe the more unusual ones. One, like social media, for example, particularly targeting communication towards youth, because like youth being a priority, trying to bring them forward, give them more educational opportunities, engage them more in research. I mean, that's almost a universal priority. I don't want to say it's universal, but it's almost there. And trying to bring them forward requires, perhaps different communication tools. And so an example that we've had some success with is during field work or whatever the work may be, taking videos, kind of 10-second videos, and then just stitching them all together. So it doesn't require, I'm not a videographer, unless we have one like Caleb around, I can't put together elaborate videos, but stitching together these 10-second clips to summarize, here was the field season, or here is this activity, whatever that activity may be, with some local music in our case anyways. It's a great way to communicate the activity and summarize it in, like a 10-minute Facebook video or whichever platform you want to use to post it. Another example that we've been we started working on with research groups active in the traditional territory in the North Yukon is developing curriculum-linked kind of activities for different grades. So again, it's a more youth-oriented communication product, and now it's linking again the research to the educational responsibility of researchers and of scientists, is to say, okay, we're looking for a grade 5 level one-day science activity based on your field, and we're engaging with different university research groups to ask, can you develop, archaeology or paleontology or hydrology? Like, we're looking for a one-day science activity this grade that can contribute to the school. So those are some interesting communication options that can sit in community. The videos can be shared for a while, and those curriculum pieces can be used for years.
Nice, thanks.
Within my role in the institution I work with, I'm really pushing for a storyteller, and we do develop curriculum, co-develop curriculum with the community. That then gets delivered in place in community, informed by the community's priorities. So not much more to elaborate beyond what Jeremy said, but in terms of storytelling, which is a really dynamic part of Indigenous communities, if capturing that, particularly within, as Jeremy mentioned, videos, really is effective, and is something that we commit a lot of our resources to developing. And I think that's really what people respond to the most.
Thank you. That's great. I know to a large degree, every community differs a little bit, but it's nice to hear that, technology is that universal for some people. And so a lot of the techniques we use in other communities can work there, but obviously your relationships and direct engagement tell you a lot about the community and what will work best for them. So thank you for that. Appreciate it.
Thanks, John. Libby, are you back with us?
I am, yes.
Oh,
Though
okay.
I am keeping my camera off because I think that is helping maybe with the bandwidth. So I apologize. Hopefully it didn't interrupt the recording. And we are over time now. So thank you all so much for for joining us and having this conversation. We've been over the course of this year, we've been inviting different groups of people to talk to us about their experiences and bringing together different types of knowledges and working in community, etc. So we greatly appreciate your perspective. And as I mentioned earlier, it might take a little bit, but we're going to get the recording of this up online for others to be able to see. And I think that's it from my perspective. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks, Libby. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you, everyone.